Sometimes a book comes along that, well, it fundamentally reshapes how we see the world. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of those, Unrestricted Warfare, written back in 1999 by PLA Colonels Cao Liang and Wang Jiangsui. This wasn't just another military strategy book.
Absolutely not. It really emerged as a direct intellectual response to the sheer dominance the United States showed during the 1991 Gulf War. That conflict prompted a serious, reevaluation of what conflict even meant in the modern era.
Right. The Gulf War was this incredibly swift, almost shocking display of American tech prowess. And for Kiao and Wang, it really hammered home a significant gap, didn't it, in traditional military capabilities?
Yeah, it did. And what was truly insightful, I think, was their early recognition that just trying to compete head to head, in that kind of technological arms race, it just wasn't a viable strategy for many nations. The gap was just too vast.
Okay, so seeing this overwhelming U.S. power, their thinking wasn't about just building a bigger military in the same mold. What direction did their analysis take instead?
Well, they started exploring a completely different paradigm of conflict. Their argument was that modern warfare had sort of evolved beyond the traditional clash of armies. It now encompassed a much broader range of instruments, things like political, economic, technological, informational, even legal and environmental dimensions.
So the core idea is that in our globally connected world, the lines of what constitutes a weapon have become, well, incredibly blurred.
Precisely. Their central thesis is actually quite stark in this interconnected and information-rich environment. Anything and everything can be weaponized. Just think about the implications, from cyber ops targeting financial infrastructure to, the strategic use of online information to sway public opinion.
And it's not just about direct state-on-state military conflict either, is it? The book really emphasizes how nations may be considered weaker militarily, how they can leverage the vulnerabilities of stronger adversaries through this idea of asymmetry.
That's a critical element, yes. For Cao and Wang, it wasn't about engaging the U.S. military head-on. It was about identifying and exploiting the dependencies of a technologically advanced opponent, their reliance on networks, their open media, the complexities of their financial systems, using unconventional methods. That's what we mean by asymmetry, not fighting on the same terms, but hitting where they're vulnerable in different ways.
It's really quite striking how many of the scenarios they outlined back then, well, they seem to resonate with events we've seen unfold since. Things like sophisticated cyber intrusions, the use of economic leverage in international affairs.
Indeed. It really speaks to the foresight embedded in their analysis, and that really sets the stage for our mission today, to dissect the key tenets of unrestricted warfare, understand its underlying logic, and show how this framework has influenced not just military thinking, but broader global dynamics in ways that, directly impact your understanding of what's happening right now.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit to that pivotal moment, the 1991 Gulf War. You mentioned it was a revelation. What specific aspects of that conflict really stood out to Keo and Wang?
Well, for them, the Gulf War was a clear demonstration of what they called systemized warfare. The seamless integration of precision air power, stealth tech, real-time intelligence, network command and control. It showcased a level of technological synergy that was just unprecedented.
It was like witnessing a completely new way of waging war, wasn't it? One that most other nations simply couldn't replicate at the time.
Exactly. And the authors recognized that trying to match that level of technological sophistication through, a conventional arms buildup, well, it was a long-term and incredibly resource-intensive path. So that led them to explore alternative, more innovative approaches to strategic competition.
So rather than trying to build, say, comparable tanks or jets, they started thinking about targeting the fundamental systems that those technologies depended upon.
Precisely. The focus shifted from the traditional objective of solely defeating an enemy's armed forces to something broader, disrupting and undermining their critical systems, their economy, their information infrastructure, the morale of their society, essential services, even their governance structures.
And they also noted, didn't they, that even with this overwhelming military superiority, the U.S. didn't always achieve its strategic goals. They cited places like Somalia, Bosnia.
Yes, exactly. Those instances highlighted that technological dominance alone wasn't a guarantee of strategic success, especially when faced with complex political landscapes and, asymmetric challenges. They observed that military might didn't automatically translate to the desired political outcomes in every context.
So the strategic focus began to move from controlling physical territory to potentially controlling these interconnected systems. It's a subtle shift, but wow, a profound one.
That's a key point. The emerging idea was that strategic goals could be achieved by creating instability in economies, maybe fostering social discord, discrediting institutions, and basically outmaneuvering adversaries within these global networks, often without resorting to traditional military force at all.
It almost sounds like they were envisioning a type of conflict that operates, in the background,
Hmm.
in the realms of finance and information, largely unseen by the public.
That's a very apt description, I think. The authors argued that the primary battleground of the future would increasingly be in these non-kinetic domains: the information space, financial markets, the media environment, even the legal arena, often operating below the threshold of what we traditionally think of as war.
So the key takeaway from the Gulf War, according to Keogh and Wang, wasn't just about the scale of American power, but about a fundamental transformation in how power is projected and, I guess, challenged in the modern world. It signaled a new kind of vulnerability, even for the most powerful.
Precisely so. It was the realization that in this new era, the ability to strategically disrupt critical systems could be just as effective, maybe even more effective, than achieving military parity.
Which brings us neatly to the central concept of the book itself, unrestricted warfare. Sounds like it really challenges many of our uh, long-held assumptions about conflict.
It fundamentally does. The core assertion is that the traditional boundaries and categories that have historically defined warfare, they're becoming increasingly irrelevant. Concepts like established international conventions, treaties governing conduct of war, the clear distinction between uniformed combatants and civilians, all of these are challenged in this new paradigm.
Okay, so if the old rules and boundaries no longer really apply, what's the new guiding principle then?
The central tenet of unrestricted warfare is pretty stark. Everything is a weapon, and everywhere is the battlefield. This is a radical departure from traditional strategic thought, where conflict was typically confined, to a specific time, place, and set of actors.
It sounds like they're essentially rejecting the traditional Clausewitzian view of war as a clearly defined instrument of state policy, and also the norms in things like the Geneva Conventions.
That's a fair assessment, yeah. Traditionally, war was seen as a political act, a means to an end, controlled by the state, fought within certain boundaries. Unrestricted warfare kind of throws that out, suggesting conflict isn't neatly contained anymore. It permeates all aspects of society. It blurs the lines between political goals and the diverse methods used to achieve them. The examples they give are intentionally broad and thought-provoking. Think speculative attacks on currencies, large-scale disinformation campaigns, strategically amplifying viral content, maybe even exploiting environmental vulnerabilities.
Wow. So the clear distinctions we once had, peace and war, combatant and civilian, even the physical battlefield versus the home front, those are all becoming blurred then.
Exactly. The soldier in this new form of warfare, well, it could be a highly skilled computer programmer launching a cyber op, right?
Right.
Or a business executive doing sophisticated economic espionage, a journalist framing a narrative strategically, even a central banker influencing global financial flows.
And the battlefield could be anything from a network of computer servers to a TV studio or a courtroom dealing with international litigation.
Precisely. It expands the definition dramatically.
And the authors weren't just presenting abstract theories, were they? They pointed to examples already emerging back in the late 90s.
They did. They specifically highlighted the growing potential for, major disruption through cyber attacks. Also, the use of financial manipulation as a tool of economic coercion, and the increasing sophistication of psychological ops aimed at influencing public opinion across borders.
It almost sounds like they were arguing that many of these lower intensity conflicts, things we might not usually call war, like, say, a major financial crisis or widespread social unrest fueled by online narratives, could actually be manifestations of this new form of unrestricted warfare.
That's exactly their argument. They frame unrestricted warfare as a logical, maybe even rational response to significant power imbalances. It allows nations perhaps lacking traditional military strength to still pursue strategic goals by operating in these less regulated, more ambiguous domains.
So it's about strategically exploiting that ambiguity, acting in ways that don't necessarily trigger a conventional military response, but can still exert considerable pressure and erode an adversary's strength.
Exactly. You could call it the art of weaponizing ambiguity. And there's a big psychological dimension, too. By using a multitude of tactics simultaneously, often in unexpected ways, the goal is to disorient the opponent, force them to divert resources across loads of fronts, and ultimately undermine their will to resist, maybe without ever engaging in a direct military fight.
This redefinition of warfare has a profound consequence, doesn't it? It fundamentally alters our understanding of who can even be considered a participant in conflict.
It absolutely does. The emergence of the non-military warrior is really a central tenet of unrestricted warfare. Those traditional distinctions, soldier versus civilian, the state's exclusive control over force, they become significantly blurred.
So in this new context, who are these non-military warriors?
Well, they encompass a really wide range of individuals who possess strategic leverage in these non-military spheres. Think about, say, hedge fund managers whose decisions can impact currencies, right? Or hackers who can disrupt critical infrastructure. Social media influencers who shape public discourse, political movements, even people working within NGOs who might subtly be advancing specific foreign policy agendas.
It sounds like virtually anyone with influence in these interconnected domains could potentially become a tool, whether they know it or not.
Precisely. By broadening the scope of the battlefield to include all facets of society, the doctrine essentially deputizes anyone with strategic value, consciously or unconsciously. And these traditionally non-military domains, the internet, global finance, the media landscape, scientific research labs, they all become potential theaters of operation.
And the authors emphasize this isn't just a future hypothetical. They saw this integration of civilian capabilities into national strategy as an ongoing thing, often decentralized and crucially deniable.
Exactly. They might point to, say, a multinational tech corporation. Ostensibly, it's operating for commercial gain, but it also gathers vast amounts of data, promotes its own tech standards that could have strategic implications, and subtly projects its nation's soft power. It's not direct military action, but the cumulative strategic effect can be significant.
This creates a massive challenge for traditional intelligence and security agencies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do you even discern hostile intent when it's coming from these non-traditional actors, often under the guise of normal civilian activity?
That's one of the core challenges, yeah. The inherent ambiguity of unrestricted warfare provides both strategic depth and, importantly, a degree of political cover. It becomes really difficult to definitively attribute responsibility or to justify a strong retaliatory response when there isn't a clear act of traditional military aggression.
The book touches on China's approach with this concept of civil-military fusion. How does that fit into this idea of non-military warriors?
Well, civil-military fusion is essentially the practical implementation of this principle. It involves a deliberate blurring of the lines between civilian enterprises, research institutions, and state strategic objectives. So you might see state-linked tech companies, educational and cultural programs like Confucius Institute, strategic venture capital investments, state-controlled media operating internationally, even academic research collaborations, all serving to varying degrees as extensions of national strategic influence.
So it's a strategy focused more on gaining influence, gathering valuable information, and shaping the global environment without necessarily deploying troops in the traditional sense. It's more subtle long-term.
Precisely so. And perhaps one of the most significant aspects is that this type of persistent competition often occurs without triggering widespread public alarm. Because it doesn't involve uniformed soldiers or overt acts of violence, it can often fly under the radar. This allows for a continuous strategic struggle without necessarily causing a major international crisis. And it potentially turns the very transparency and legal frameworks that are fundamental to democracies into, well, potential vulnerabilities. And in this environment, ordinary citizens can become unwitting participants in a conflict they might not even realize is happening.
Okay, so just to summarize our deep dive into unrestricted warfare, it emerged from the strategic lessons of the Gulf War, positing that modern conflict extends far beyond traditional military engagements. Its core tenet is that, well, virtually anything can be weaponized, leading to the rise of these non-military actors operating across a multitude of interconnected domains.
Right, and this framework fundamentally challenges our conventional understanding of what conflict even is and how power operates in the 21st century.
Which brings us to a really important question, I think, for you, our listener. In a world where these lines between peace and war are increasingly blurred, and where almost anything and anyone could potentially be weaponized, how do we truly define peace and security anymore? Considering the concepts we've explored today, what are the broader implications for the future of international relations? And, for our own lives as individuals navigating this complex landscape? It certainly gives you a lot to consider.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want to get past the headlines, understand the deeper currents shaping our world.
That's right.
And today we're doing just that. We're taking a close look at some well, let's call them unconventional forms of conflict. Stuff outlined in these excerpts we have, labeled pasted text.
Mm-hmm. Less about tanks, more about other pressures.
Exactly. We're focusing on financial and economic strategies, the murky world of cyber warfare, and also the battleground of psychology and media.
All crucial areas in modern statecraft.
Think of this as your briefing on how power works now, maybe behind the scenes. Our mission today, to pull out the key arguments from this text about these non-military tools and really get a handle on their strategic impact.
And it's essential stuff. The text really pushes this idea that traditional military power isn't the be-all and end-all anymore. It forces you to think differently about what a threat even is.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Financial and economic weapons. Usually when we think conflict, it's soldiers, planes.
The kinetic stuff.
Right. But this text argues that in our totally interconnected global economy, things like trade policies, currency manipulation, financial markets, they can hit just as hard, maybe harder.
That's a core argument they're making.
Yeah.
That hitting a nation's economy, its stability, can be more effective than trying to occupy its land.
So it's less about planting flags and more about squeezing wallets, essentially.
You can put it that way.
Yeah.
It's about applying pressure, creating internal instability, influencing decisions without firing a shot. A big shift in strategic thinking, according to the authors.
And to make this concrete, the text brings up the 1997 Asian financial crisis. It specifically mentions George Soros's role. And it frames it less as just, market forces at work and more like a potential example of economic warfare, something with huge geopolitical fallout, economic chaos, social unrest.
Yeah, the text uses it to illustrate how major financial plays, regardless of the original intent perhaps, can have these massive strategic ripple effects. It really highlights the vulnerabilities in our global financial system.
Okay, so bringing that idea forward, the text suggests China is actively using these kinds of economic tools.
Very actively, according to this source.
Like weaponizing access to its huge market, controlling exports of critical stuff like rare earth minerals.
Yeah, things modern tech relies on.
And also strategic investments like the Belt and Road Initiative. They even point to the Australia example.
Yes, after Australia called for the COVID origin investigation.
Exactly. China imposed trade restrictions. The text presents that as a pretty clear case of economic leverage being used for strategic discipline, almost.
Precisely. And that shows how economic ties, that interdependence we always talk about, can be turned into a weapon, a way to shape behavior without overt aggression. The BRI, for instance. It's infrastructure, yes, but the text argues it's also about building dependencies, expanding influence.
Then there's the digital yuan, the ECNY, and China's own payment system, CIPS, sort of an alternative to SWIFT.
Right, the main network for international bank transfers.
The authors here see these not just as tech upgrades, but as potential tools for, financial warfare, maybe aiming to chip away at the U.S. dollar's dominance.
It's about building options, isn't it? Creating a parallel system that could operate outside the established dollar-centric one.
What are the implications of that, then?
Well, the text suggests that the more transactions happen outside that dollar system, the less bite things like U.S. financial sanctions might have down the road.
Yeah.
It's subtle, but potentially, game-changing for global finance.
The text also gets into debt trap diplomacy, this idea that lending big sums to developing nations can lead to China gaining control over key assets if those countries struggle to repay.
Ports, railways, resources.
Yeah, so financial deals morphing into geopolitical footholds.
And what's interesting, as the text points out, is how it looks on the surface. It's framed as partnership, as development aid. But the potential long-term outcome is a shift in influence achieved through economics, not force.
So the big takeaway on the financial front, according to pasted text, seems to be Wall Street, currency markets, trade deals, these are now front lines. Economic warfare is real, destabilizing, and often flies under the radar of traditional aggression.
A powerful set of tools, no doubt.
Okay, let's switch gears. Cyber warfare. This feels like moving from the trading floor to the shadows.
It really does. And the text argues cyber warfare fundamentally changes things. It ignores borders. It allows for a sort of constant low-level engagement. Cyberspace is the battlefield, in their view.
Which makes sense when you think about how much we rely on digital systems for, everything. Power grids, finance, communication.
Data.
All of it. It's all potentially vulnerable. And the text stresses you don't need armies, just code and a connection. A single person, theoretically.
Or a small group, yeah. Could cause massive disruption. hitting companies, infrastructure, finance. The potential targets are almost limitless.
And this creates that asymmetric advantage, right, where
Mhm.
smaller players can potentially hurt much larger ones.
Absolutely. The Stuxnet virus is the classic example mentioned, targeting Iran's nuclear centrifuges. No bombs, but real physical damage caused by code. A kinetic outcome from a cyber weapon.
A sobering example. The text then points to China's heavy investment in cyber capabilities. It mentions PLA Unit 61398.
People's Liberation Army.
Right. LinkedIn reports to widespread cyber espionage against U.S. companies, defense contractors, government bodies.
China denies state involvement, of course.
Of course. But the authors of Pasted Text argue this pattern fits perfectly with their unrestricted warfare idea, targeting key sectors for national gain, often with plausible deniability.
And that deniability, the difficulty in definitively proving who launched an attack, is key. It makes cyber tools attractive, because they operate in this gray zone below the threshold of traditional armed conflict.
But it's not just spying, is it? The text talks about denial of service attacks, ransomware hitting hospitals,
Election interference.
sabotaging infrastructure. The goal often seems to be disruption, confusion, making people lose trust in their own systems.
Definitely. Imagine the chaos if a major power grid went down due to a cyber attack, or if people couldn't trust election results.
And the psychological side of that, just knowing these threats are constantly out there.
It creates a background hum of anxiety, of vulnerability. The text suggests this constant unseen pressure wears down a society's confidence and resilience over time.
Which sounds a lot like what the authors predicted. Conflict becoming constant, non-linear, kind of invisible. Cyber fits that bill perfectly.
It really does. It's potentially always on, doesn't follow battlefield lines, and you often only see the effects, not the attack itself.
And for a nation like China, the text presents cyber as a way to level the playing field, right? To
Right.
challenge more conventionally powerful nations.
It's seen as a key tool for asymmetric advantage, yes. A way to compete effectively in the 21st century without necessarily matching ship for ship or tank for tank. Okay, so we've covered finance and cyber. Let's move to maybe the most insidious area. Psychological and media warfare.
This is the fight for hearts and minds, essentially.
You could say that. Pasted text argues that controlling perceptions, shaping narratives, influencing emotions, it's just as critical as controlling land or sea. Maybe more so today.
Shaping what people believe is the ultimate goal.
Exactly. Influencing public opinion, both at home and abroad. The idea is to weaken an adversary's morale, sow division, undermine their political will, make them question their own leaders or goals.
The text uses a really stark example. That image of the U.S. soldier in Mogadishu in the 90s.
A powerful image.
The argument is that that picture, shown everywhere, did more damage to U.S. policy aims at the time than any military action. It ultimately pushed towards withdrawal, the camera as a weapon.
It's a potent illustration of how media narratives can shape strategic realities, especially in open societies where public opinion heavily influences government action. It shows a vulnerability.
And in the digital age, the text says this has just gone into overdrive. The battlefield is now social media, online news, everywhere information spreads. It specifically mentions China building its own global media networks, CGTN, Xinhua, platforms we use daily like TikTok, WeChat, plus investing in foreign media outlets.
All aimed at promoting a pro-China narrative, countering criticism.
And the text is pretty direct, saying this involves censorship and sometimes outright disinformation.
Well, the text suggests a two-pronged approach. 1, paint a positive picture of China. 2, destabilize adversaries by eroding trust in their institutions, their media. Create confusion.
How? Through things like false stories, conspiracy theories.
Exactly. Flooding the zone with conflicting information, making it hard for people in open societies to know what's true. This breeds cynicism, division, and makes societies easier to influence externally, the text argues.
It's weaponizing the openness of those societies against them.
That's the core idea presented, that freedom of information can be exploited to undermine the very society that cherishes it. It erodes that shared sense of reality.
The text also mentions intimidation tactics, military parades, harsh rhetoric.
Portraying any criticism as an attack.
Yeah, trying to rally domestic nationalism while maybe deterring foreign opposition. And then there's this interesting idea of silence as a weapon.
Strategic ambiguity.
Right. Not saying anything, keeping intentions hidden, making it harder for others to react effectively.
It's about controlling the information flow by withholding information too. Creating uncertainty, making adversaries guess, potentially delaying their response until it's too late.
So ultimately, the message from pasted text on this front is perception is power. In this information age, winning means controlling the story.
Whether through credibility or distortion or just keeping people off balance. The aim, as the text suggests, might be less about military victory and more about causing an opponent to sort of weaken from within.
It's a pretty sobering view. Makes you think about the information you consume differently.
It absolutely should. The need for critical thinking, for media literacy, is paramount. The text implies that the very nature of open information environments makes them battlegrounds now.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive based on paste and text. The really crucial takeaway for you, the listener, is understanding these potent but often unseen forms of warfare. Finance, cyber, information. They're not sideshows. The text presents them as central strategic arenas now.
And remember, the goal outlined isn't always about provoking a shooting war. It's often about achieving strategic aims subtly, persistently, often deniably.
Which leads to our final thought for you today. How might these more subtle forms of influence, the ones discussed in this text, be shaping your own view of the world? Think about the news you see, the social media you scroll through, even maybe economic news. Where do everyday interactions end and strategic statecraft begin?
It's a blurry line.
It really is. Being aware, being critical, that seems to be the best defense. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. You're busy. We get it. You want to understand the forces shaping our world, but maybe you don't have time for stacks of research.
Right.
That's where we come in. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really significant concept, one that sort of redefines modern conflict.
It really does.
It's called unrestricted warfare, based on the work by Qiao Liang and Wang Jiangsui. And their core idea: forget traditional battlefields. Conflict now seeps into, well, seemingly peaceful areas.
Exactly. We've been looking closely at excerpts from their book, and our mission today for you is really to unpack how this framework changes our understanding of global power dynamics.
And the implications are quite surprising, right?
Oh, absolutely. Eye-opening. We're going to kick things off by looking at two key examples they highlight: legal warfare and environmental warfare.
Right. Legal warfare. Some people call it lawfare, yeah.
That's the term.
So this isn't about tanks and planes. It's using the legal system itself as a weapon. How does that actually play out?
Well, think of it as using laws, domestic, international, court systems, treaties, really strategically, to achieve certain goals. The authors give some pretty clear examples.
Like what?
Like using lawsuits just to harass corporations. Tie them up. Cost them money, time, focus.
Okay, that makes sense. Slowing them down.
Right. Or strategically using trade rules, intellectual property regulations. Imagine using IP law to deliberately hinder a competitor's tech progress. It's not just following the law. It's actively manipulating the legal structure for an advantage.
So it's definitely more than just playing by the rules. It's like weaponizing the rule book itself, playing chess with statutes.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. And it goes beyond domestic stuff, into the international arena, too.
How so?
The authors talk about manipulating international organizations.
Yeah.
Pushing certain resolutions, using the internal legal mechanisms of these bodies to isolate adversaries or exert pressure.
Okay.
A really vivid example they point to is China's activities in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
Building those artificial islands, militarizing them.
Right, we've all seen that.
And also deploying all sorts of legal arguments to back their claims. It's a parallel track.
And wasn't there that big international ruling, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016?
Yes, and it ruled against many of those claims.
But China just ignored it.
They refused to recognize it. And that, right there, perfectly illustrates the point, doesn't it? The legal system becomes another venue for asserting power, almost detached from the actual legal merits sometimes.
It's about the performance of legality, maybe?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
And another fascinating angle the authors bring up is just overwhelming an opponent with legal and bureaucratic complexity, sheer volume.
So the goal isn't always to win,
Yeah,
just to paralyze.
exactly. Slow down their response, drain their resources, create this knot of entanglement. And they highlight a key asymmetry here.
What's that?
Democracies, they're generally bound by trying to apply laws consistently. There's an expectation of rule of law. Authoritarian systems might feel, well, less constrained. They could apply laws more selectively, more flexibly, when it suits their strategic aims.
Ah, so one side feels obliged to follow the spirit and letter, while the other might just use the letter when convenient. That makes democracies potentially more vulnerable to this lawfare.
That's the argument presented. It really makes you think about how different political systems are inherently positioned for this kind of strategic legal maneuvering.
Okay, let's shift then. Environmental warfare. This sounds different. Less about courts, more about, well, the planet.
Yeah, it's presented in the text as maybe a bit more speculative, but still strategically critical. The core idea is manipulating ecological systems or leveraging environmental dependencies to coerce others.
How would that work?
Control over vital resources is central. Water is a huge one. The text specifically mentions China's position controlling the headwaters of major Asian rivers. Think Mekong, Brahmaputra.
Ah, right. Those rivers are lifelines for countries downstream. Vietnam, Cambodia, India.
Exactly. So if you control the source, you can potentially control the flow using dams, restricting access. That gives you immense leverage over those downstream nations.
You could affect their agriculture, their drinking water. Huge economic and social impact. That's serious leverage.
Absolutely devastating, potentially. It creates instability, unrest, huge strategic weight. And beyond water, the authors also talk about rare earth minerals.
Oh, yeah. Those are crucial for everything now. Phones, green energy tech, defense systems.
Critical. And China has a, well, dominant position in the global supply chain for many of these.
I remember that spat with Japan back in 2010. They restricted exports,
I
right?
did.
Yeah.
And the text points to more recent tensions involving the U.S. as well. These actions might be framed as economic decisions, trade policy.
But the underlying strategic goal is pretty clear.
Unmistakably, it highlights the vulnerabilities baked into global supply chains, especially for these critical materials.
So whether it's lawfare or controlling resources like water or minerals, the main idea seems to be gaining advantage without a traditional military fight.
That's the heart of it.
Influencing the very systems, legal, economic, environmental, that structure how nations interact.
That's precisely the argument. These apparently non-military, even peaceful domains can be weaponized, not for battlefield victory in the old sense, but for structural dominance, for creating dependencies, for shaping the environment to your advantage.
And this isn't just theory tucked away in a book, is it? The authors point to real-world applications. Let's talk about Taiwan. The approach there seems multifaceted.
Oh, definitely. The text describes a really comprehensive campaign. It's way beyond just the military threat. It includes constant psychological pressure, cyber attacks, economic coercion, relentless information warfare.
All designed to weaken Taiwan's resolve and its international support.
Exactly. Erode both. Think about the PLA aircraft flying into Taiwan's air defense zone almost daily.
We see those headlines all the time.
The book suggests that's not necessarily saber-rattling for an imminent invasion, but more about creating constant tension, a low-level hum of intimidation. It's psychological.
Okay, a form of pressure.
And that's layered with things we don't always see, like cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure. Plus, sophisticated disinformation campaigns trying to sow doubt, undermine trust in their democracy.
And then there's the economic side.
Huge. Pressuring countries to drop diplomatic recognition of Taiwan in favor of Beijing.
Right. And businesses get caught in the crossfire too, don't they?
Absolutely. Foreign companies getting blacklisted or facing boycotts just for listing Taiwan as a country on their website, for example.
That forces a kind of economic alignment, or at least silence.
It does. And the text also mentions the self-censorship you see. Hollywood, big multinational corporations, being very careful not to offend Beijing on the Taiwan issue to maintain access to that massive Chinese market.
So the war is waged in markets, through influence, even through silence. It's subtle.
It's the principle in action. No shots fired, necessarily, but immense pressure applied through non-military means. A gradual erosion.
What about the tech sector? The book mentions TikTok and Huawei specifically. How do they fit in?
Yeah, they're presented as really interesting case studies. Civilian technologies with potential strategic uses. Take TikTok.
More than just dancing videos.
According to the author's framework, yes. It's potentially a massive data collection tool, and its algorithms shape what millions see potentially influencing discourse, promoting narratives. The text uses this striking phrase, civilian system deployed for military advantage.
Makes you think. And Huawei. The 5G rollout caused a lot of global debate.
It did. And the concerns, as framed in the book, went beyond just, potential spying. It's about strategic dependency.
Yeah, so.
If a potential adversary builds and controls the core digital infrastructure, the 5G networks that a nation relies on, Well, that gives them enormous leverage and potential access down the line.
Right. It's described as almost a strategic encirclement through civilian technology.
That's the phrase. It expands the notion of national security way beyond just military hardware.
It's surprising, though, that the book even brings the COVID-19 pandemic into this framework. How does a global health crisis fit into unrestricted warfare?
Well, the authors analyze the response. They point to China's mask diplomacy, providing aid, PPE.
Which seemed like goodwill initially.
But it was often paired, the text argues, with information campaigns to deflect blame for origins, criticize Western responses, and China's dominance in producing essential medical supplies like PPE and pharmaceuticals. That dominance itself became a point of leverage.
So even a crisis response can have strategic undertones.
The suggestion is that the outcome was a subtle shift in global narratives, a reinforcement of certain dependencies, all achieved without military action. It shows how even humanitarian situations can become contested strategic spaces.
Wow. It really paints a picture of a long-term integrated strategy, legal, economic, tech, information, all working together. It's not just reacting, it's proactively shaping the global environment.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a really tough question, especially for countries like the U.S. How do you even counter this kind of conflict? It doesn't follow the old rules.
And that is precisely the American dilemma that the authors identified quite early on. How does a nation that's built on clear rules, transparency, a distinction between peace and war, how does it effectively deal with a conflict that ignores those boundaries, that often operates in the gray zones, below the threshold of traditional warfare?
That's a fundamental challenge, isn't it?
It is, because America's traditional strengths, its massive military, its tech leadership, its alliances, they're primarily designed for conventional conflicts.
Right. A carrier group isn't much use against a disinformation campaign or manipulation of international law.
Exactly. The authors argue those tools aren't ideally suited for countering, say, currency manipulation, complex lawfare, corporate influence ops, or subtle tech dependencies.
And the book suggests America's own strengths might be vulnerabilities here.
In a way, yes. The very openness of a liberal democracy, freedom of speech, open markets, decentralized systems, these can potentially be exploited.
We hear debates about that. Things like foreign companies buying land near sensitive military bases or foreign funding influencing policy debates through NGOs or think tanks.
Right. These actions might not be strictly illegal. They aren't overt acts of war. But cumulatively, the text suggests they can erode autonomy, create dependencies, and subtly shift the strategic landscape. It's that creeping erosion idea.
It's hard for a system based on clear laws and overt threats to deal with ambiguity like that.
That's the crux of it. The U.S. system is geared towards responding to clear violations or aggression. It struggles with these ambiguous gray zone tactics that, added up, have a real strategic effect.
Has the U.S. started adapting?
The text acknowledges efforts, yes. Things like trying to decouple tech supply chains in critical areas, using sanctions, more scrutiny on foreign investment, boosting cyber defenses. But these efforts are often seen as reactive, maybe fragmented, lacking a single overarching strategic doctrine to counter this kind of omnidirectional, persistent competition. There isn't always consensus on the nature or even the existence of the threat.
So the book's main message for the U.S. and maybe other democracies is wake up. Recognize what's actually happening.
Pretty much. Acknowledge the broader definition of warfare that's in play, recalibrate legal tools, institutional responses, build much stronger public-private partnerships, because so many of these battlefields are in the private sector, tech, finance, information.
And the core warning is stark.
It is. The side that doesn't even recognize that the war has begun is already at a serious disadvantage.
So unrestricted warfare, it's really more than just a military strategy book. It's a whole philosophy about power in our hyper-connected age.
Absolutely. It forces you to completely rethink what counts as a threat, how influence is wielded, what security even means today.
And written over 2 decades ago, it seems incredibly prescient.
Remarkably so. It anticipated this shift, this escape of war from the purely military domain into, well, almost every aspect of society.
And a key feature is how subtle it can be, continuous, often invisible. It can happen during what looks like peacetime, using the language of cooperation while maybe undermining stability.
Right. The absence of bombs falling doesn't mean strategic conflict isn't happening. That's a crucial takeaway.
And the weapons are different now.
Completely. Corporations, social media apps, ideologies, currencies, legal codes. The lines get incredibly blurry. Almost anything can be weaponized in this framework.
Which means for some countries, maybe like China, as the authors imply, this offers a way to gain influence without triggering a massive military confrontation.
It's a potential roadmap for rising powers in this new era.
But for others, especially liberal democracies used to older models of conflict, it's a massive wake-up call.
A fundamental challenge to reimagine security. It's not just about defense budgets and military readiness anymore.
It's about resilience everywhere. Digital, financial, informational, legal resilience.
Exactly. Deterrence has to be multidimensional too. It can't just be about threatening military retaliation.
It leads to a pretty sobering thought, doesn't it? That war isn't the exception anymore. Maybe it's the baseline condition, this idea of strategic permanence. Constantly engaged?
It's a challenging concept.
Yeah.
And it raises that profound final question, really, for all of us.
Which is?
How do societies built for peacetime, with peacetime rules and assumptions, adapt to this kind of constant, low-level, often ambiguous strategic competition? How do we rethink war when it looks like this?
When it doesn't have a clear beginning or end.
Precisely. The authors leave us with that unsettling idea. In this long, quiet, pervasive struggle, the winner might just be the one who understands the game first, engages everywhere, and prepares for the long haul.
A huge amount to think about there. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into unrestricted warfare. It's definitely clear that understanding these non-traditional approaches to conflict is vital today.
Absolutely critical.
We hope this discussion prompts you, our listeners, to reflect on these ideas and maybe see current global events through a slightly different lens. This is really just starting the conversation. We encourage you to explore the source material if you can.
Definitely worth it.
And perhaps the most challenging question to leave you with is, are we as societies even fully aware of all the battlefields in this potential war without end? And are we actually prepared to compete on them?